integrate the national asset of geospatial information. The Geospatial Commission holds budget for the cross-government work. So within the Geospatial Commission at the moment, one of our projects is to investigate the FAIR information, looking to improve data and having the right data at the right time to make the right decisions. At the moment, we find FAIR can be a little bit ambiguous. So we're interested in listening to the community to see how they view and approach FAIR and the right to data. As a reminder on FAIR data are data which meet the following principles of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, with the intent of making data more valuable as it's easier to find, combine, and integrate. Applying the FAIR principles will improve data, access to better location data which is available for more people. Using these principles to drive and guide data information, we can enable and promote easier use of easier use of data, helping to drive innovation, increase productivity and reduce costs, benefiting a country's economy and wider society. In many jurisdictions, different parts of government adopt and data exchange and reuse is difficult or prevented. One of the impacts of the pandemic has been the acceleration in demand for online digital services and access to digital data. As land administration and management organisations transform, providing solutions to meet the market needs and challenges to provide information accessible and used. There's going to be 2 case studies followed by a panel discussion. We invite experts in the land and management join this discussion to explore what the benefits and opportunities are and how challenges have been overcome and what the long-term implications might be. First of all, we're going to hear from Lynn Nicholson and Dr. George Graham from Her Majesty's Land Registry, who will discuss improving interoperability on Her Majesty's Land Registry data projects. So I'm just going to introduce you to Lynn and to George. So Lynn is Head of Data Products and Services at Her Majesty's Land Registry. She leads several teams of product managers who manage the data and commercial services and the various transformational projects within Hmlr's Transforming and Data Programme. Dr. George Graham is Head of Data Science for Her Majesty's Land Registry, and he leads a growing practice of data scientists exploring utility of machine learning to support Her Majesty's Land Registry ambiguous digital transformation. That's a mouthful. George joined Land Registry in 2020, having previously built and led data science R&D labs across industry and academia. So over to you, Lynn and George. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello everybody, I'm Lynn Nicholson and we've already had the introduction, so I'm Head of Data Products and Services at Land Registry. I would like to start off this presentation just talking very, very briefly around the data that we hold in Land Registry. So we are the Land Registry for England and Wales. So let's break the data down into 2 distinct parts. So we have the register, which you can see there. So every registered title in England and Wales contains one of these registers, which records who owns the property, how much they paid for it, what rights have they got on there, what covenants have they got on there. So in other words, what stops them from doing certain things, keeping pigs or whatever it might be. There's some very strange things on there, sometimes dating back many decades. So that's the register. We have around 26 million of these, just over 26 million registered titles in England and Wales. So we'll now move on to the second part of our data, which is our spatial data. So we hold spatial data. The 2 images on the left hand side show what we call our title plans. So they are the guaranteed extents of how much somebody actually owns. And when we say guaranteed extents, what we mean is if we make an error on those titles and somebody suffers a loss as a result of it, then we pay compensation to them. So the image furthest on the left is what we call a raster image, and that is where that's a very old title plan, probably going back to the 60s or the 70s, when caseworkers would draw the red edging and onto the plan. That plan is then scanned and then and held as a scanned image within our systems. The very middle image that you see is what we call a vector image. So that image has been created on a computer mapping system that was introduced in the 90s. So that's our vector image. The very farthest right image is what we call our index map. So this is a seamless map of England and Wales, and all those pink tintings that you can see on there represent what we call a polygon. There are well over 32 million polygons on our system, and a polygon can range from being a very small garage, or it could be a whole housing estate, or it could be part of a mountain. It could be absolutely huge. So that is the index map is what is the first thing that somebody will search within the registry to see if their property is actually registered. So next we will move on to how we have converted that data into publishable data sets. So down the left hand side, I'm not going to necessarily go through all this today, but down the left hand side we are the results of a survey, very large survey that we did probably around about 8-9 years ago. And we asked the market, if we were actually to publish any data, what would you'd be most interested in, or what would drive your business greater than any other data that we hold? Top of the list was, we want to know who owns the land. Second was, how much land is included in the title. So in other words, what is the area of the land that somebody owns? Then the third request was, how much did the current and previous owner actually pay for that title? And then in the law within England is that we have two specific estates. There are others, but I'm not going to go into those today. But we have two specific estates. One is a freehold title to a freehold estate in the land. That is a perpetual title that goes on and is passed down. There's a leasehold estate in that particular property, which has got a start and an end date. That's the main difference. I could talk for hours about the differences, but those are the two main differences. So a lot of businesses want to know, what are the details of that lease? How many years does it have on it? Because that would affect the value of that particular property. And then we had requests for alert systems. So they wanted to alert for anything that was particularly restrictive on that register. And as I said earlier, there are some very strange things on old registers. So you can't hang your washing out on a Sunday, or you can't conduct, believe me, these are true restrictive covenants. You can't conduct witchcraft in the bottom 20 feet of your garden and all that sort of thing. And people wanted alerts to those, what was restrictive on the property. The most common ones are, you can't keep caravans on the drive, or that sort of thing. And then another request was, how are conveyancers or solicitors actually performing? So are they sending in applications to us when they say they are, and how long are they taking? And then we got requests to track applications once they came in. On the right hand side, show you the 12 data sets that we then created, and then subsequently published out there. And I'm like I say, I don't want to go through all of them necessarily, but there's what we call a bulk or a wholesale data set that shows UK companies, overseas companies. There's our spatial data sets, which are absolutely huge. So you can download all those polygons that you saw earlier. There's our price paid data sets, which George is going to show you shortly. And then there's the registered lease data set, etc., etc. So you can see from what was asked during that time, way back in 2014-15, we have subsequently published 12 data sets. So now we'll move on to the licensing. So we've got the open government license, which is essentially a government, as it suggests, a government license where we've got 6 of our data sets. 6 of those 12 are out on an open government license, which basically means you can they're free of charge. All of those are free of charge, and they can basically license them to do what they want to do with them. 2 of them are on commercial reuse. So the Polygon data set that I spoke about is on a chargeable license that people pay for a whole year's worth of licensing. And the Leasehold data set is out there under various licensing models, depending on what you want to do with the data. Then there's the direct use license that we have, which is essentially business to consumer license. And then we have an exploration license, which means that on the chargeable data set, you can take it for a short amount of time and explore with it and trial it out and develop propositions as a result of that particular license. So we do have a very mixed licensing model for our data sets. So we'll move on to the next slide now, which is, I want to now very quickly, I'm going to pass you over to George now, but I just want to make an introduction to, this was our vision for a publication portal or a publication platform. So in the beginning, those data sets were all out there using third-party suppliers. So they were out there with very, very differing experiences for customers. And so we were paying third-party licensors to store them and publish them. 2 years ago, we had a vision, and that vision was a platform that provides better awareness, managed access for customers, more of a consistent approach, more options for gaining data for the users. So everything in one place, a one-stop shop. So I'll now pass you over to George so that he can show you what that looks like.
Thank you, Lynn. So good morning, everyone. I'm George Graham, Head of Data Science. Fantastic to meet you. So yeah, I'm just going to guide you through some of the ways that people, our customers and our data users can access and use data. So just going to show you what the Use Land and Property Data Portal looks like. So here you can see the Government UK service. It's a beta service where users can register and log in and access various types of data from our catalogue. So it gives you a really nice interface for not only cataloging the data, but then accessing individually in 2 ways, either as a download to your local computer, so you can download a CSV file or other formats, or you can access via a web API, so a RESTful API that allows you to access the full data and download in a similar way. We also have other data sets available in other routes, so I just wanted to quickly show you those. We have our completely open data, which is our price paid data and our UK house pricing index data, and some of our transactional data available via landregistry.data.gov.uk. So this is a separate portal from Use Land and Property and doesn't require any registration. And it's interesting because it allows people to explore data a little more interactively. So you don't have to download that data and then explore it. You can produce some fairly simple displays, as I'm showing on the right-hand side, of some of the price data, for example, over time or over space or by different types of property. The interesting thing about this platform is it also includes direct access to that data using a Sparkle endpoint. So this is a linked data platform. So the data that's underneath the platform that you see here is all represented in a certain way that enables query via Sparkle. So developers and people who are interested in direct access and manipulation of the data can get to it this way. And this is really interesting because this hits or gets a lot of hits every day. So we have automated systems and individuals accessing this data at about a rate of 2 million requests per day. It's a really sought after and well-used data set. And then both those sources of data get harvested by central government. So we make some of our data sets, particularly the geospatial data sets, interoperable by providing UK Gemini standard metadata so that central government can harvest them onto the central data portal. So this is data.gov.uk, where you can search for data sets across government, and our data is represented there because of that markup and metadata standard that's in use. And that's really interesting because the central data portal really helps with discoverability. You don't have to go directly to Hmlr to find the data. You can go to central government via this data portal to find our data. But actually, even more interesting than that, people who don't know the central government portal can use familiar web search. So if you use a search engine that's available for crawling the web, here I'm showing you Google dataset search, you can also find our data. So interoperability is really improved by kind of obvious markup with metadata standards that enable discoverability and access by a range of different portals. So yeah, feel free to explore our data and see what you think. And I just want to show you some examples of how people are exploring, finding, and then using our data. So typically we find that our price paid data, for example, is taken by very large companies that want to provide customer services in terms of navigation and understanding and exploration of the property market. So here you can see two examples from essentially some of our biggest market movers, Zoopla and Rightmove, who provide intelligence across the UK housing and property market. And here they use price paid data on their platform. So you can put in a location that you're interested in and it will go away, interrogate our price paid data, pull it back and provide it nicely to the user without the user having any understanding or need to understand the data behind it. And I'm going to pass back to Lynn to talk a little bit about customer feedback.
Thank you, George. So last year we decided we do engage with the market quite frequently to keep ourselves up to date with technologies and the way that our customers' businesses are developing. And we did a huge exercise last year in terms of engaging with that market. So we did a series of surveys, face-to-face interviews with customers to ask them the question, if we could improve any of those data sets in any way that would help your business or make it more valuable to you, what would that be? So the next slide will show you some of the comments that we got back from there. So we had hundreds of comments, and we in the end we reached out to well over 2,000 users in the end. But these ones I have surfaced because they show you what was being said predominantly during that feedback. So better and more complete and accurate. Now, the unique property reference number, that is a number that is created and is being more and more used certainly throughout the UK, and it's being considered as being a linkable, something linkable that will link all data sets together, and we only add that your unique property reference number to certain ones of our data sets. It's not in all of them. So a large proportion of those customers wanted that number adding into the data sets. Secondly was API access, and I know George has spoken already about API access, but we haven't taken that any further in terms of somebody being able to get API access to the actual data they want. So it's either the whole data set or nothing. So or it's just a complete download. So what we want to take that API strategy further. We want to progress with that API strategy, because what we tend to do, our strategy at the moment is a complete download of the data every month, and then follow that on subsequently with change only update files or another whole download. So customers have said, and their businesses have progressed now so that they need more real time, or they even need a lot of the data daily wherever possible. So an API feed of some form was almost right at the top. And then one customer said, we have a long-standing dream about linking the data, and that's understanding the relations. So I've spoken earlier about freeholds and leasehold estates in land, and leaseholds. There's a lot more leaseholds than people believe there to be. There must be in the region of probably 12 to 15 million leasehold estates within England and Wales, and it's finding that link. So at the moment, that link is very fragmented between certainly to the market as to, on a particular property, if that's leasehold, what is the leasehold information, what is the freehold information, and vice versa. So the next was, we need traceable, unique identifier to be able to connect applications, and that was, we try to automate everything, would be useful in price paid data. So that's something else we're looking at. And once again, not only the very last one that I've pulled out here is not only APIs, but live feeds into the spatial data. So WMS or WFS feeds into the spatial data. Our spatial data is a huge data set, and a lot of, we've got almost 70 users of that particular data set at the moment, and the way that their businesses are transforming, they want to be able to have a feed into that data rather than have to download it every month. So that's what our users are saying. So we've categorized those requests of all that feedback that we got. We've categorized them into huge themes, and the themes are transaction access, APIs, etc., frequency of any updates. So should we continue to do change only updates, because not everybody wants APIs. We need to make them more frequent and not once a month. And then to put additional attributes into the data as well to make them more linkable. So those are the three categories, and we'll talk about those in a second. So I'm going to pass you back to George now, who is going to talk about how we've progressed. So as well as doing all that survey with the market, simultaneous to that, George and his team carried out an assessment of the data. So we benchmarked ourselves as to where we were in terms of the findability of it, the accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of that data. So I'll pass you on to George now.
Thank you, Lynn. So I'm going to circle back to Kathryn's introduction, where she gave a really nice summary of the FAIR principles, these 4 principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and just really quickly show you how we're making this real. So Kathryn mentioned it's quite ambiguous. You know, what does findable data look like? What does interoperable data really mean? So we've been carrying out this piece of work to dive into that, and to make the FAIR principles less ambiguous, we've been using what's called the FAIRS project's data object assessment metrics. So FAIR is a big European Union research project, and out of that they've provided additional information or additional description about each of these FAIR principles, and some really specific guidance on what FAIR looks like. So for each of the principles, various sub-principles that describe in quite a lot of detail what that actually means. So in terms of interoperability, for example, the focus of today, they're focusing on being able to include links between the data and its related entities, the use of semantic resources in your data sets, and you representing your data sets using formal knowledge representation languages. Now, some of our data sets in Hmlr are represented like that, and others are not. So we've used this object assessment metric approach as a way of scoring our data sets in terms of their fairness. And we found it's a really interesting way of assessing both in general, but also specifically the fairness of our data. So I'm just going to share some of the output with you. So what we've been able to do is go through all of our data sets and score the findability, the accessibility, the interoperability, and the reusability across the board. And we are producing dashboards that show us in general and specifically what our data sets perform well on and how they perform poorly. So we're able to get sort of percentage measures of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, and understand where we're performing well or we're performing weakly. And we get, based on those object assessment metrics, really detailed descriptors of the things that we're doing well and the things that we're doing not so well on in our data sets, and therefore where we need to spend some time improving our data sets to improve their fairness. So this is across the board. We can also dive into specific data sets. So this is our corporate ownership data set for the UK, for example. where we can split it even further and say not only understanding the fairness, but understanding the fairness through different access routes. So if you look at that data set available as an API, it scores in a particular way. And if you look at that data set as a download, so a CSV bulk download, it scores in a slightly different way. So we're learning quite a lot about our own data sets by assessing them in this way and understanding in combination with our customer feedback where we can make improvements. And as I say, we've done that for all of our data sets. I won't dive into the details, but the summary in kind of an average sense is that our FAIR performance is really noticeably lower in terms of interoperability and reusability than it is in findability and accessibility. So we've shared with you some of the portals we have that users and customers can find our data through, and they can access our data through using various mechanisms. But once they've got that data, it turns out that being able to push that data together with other data sets, maybe third-party data sets or data sets they've built themselves, is actually quite tricky because the way the data is represented in terms of its structure or its knowledge representation language, and therefore that affects the usability or the reusability. So we've identified some pockets or some chunks of work we have to do in the interoperability and the reusability space because of the use of this metric. So we found it a kind of very useful way of summarizing the work that we need to do with our data sets. And these map back to the customer feedback and the needs, the principles and the themes that Lynn has just spoken about. So I'll pass back to Lynn for some more detail on that before we look at the plan of action going forwards and then some summaries and take-home messages.
Thanks, George. So this is only a snapshot of the exercise that we carried out. So we took those customer needs that I spoke about earlier. So I want a live feed into your Polygon data set, that huge data set. I want a live feed into there. So the principle and the principles that George has spoken about, we mapped that to a principle. So data is accessible through a standardized communication protocol. And then we mapped it to a particular theme. So in this case, that theme would be transaction access and frequency of updates. So the themes that I spoke about earlier. And then I can't relate or connect anything to the lease data. And this comes back to my point around customers desperately wanted to find that link between freehold and leasehold titles. And so the principle that maps to is metadata, and data includes links between the data and it's. So we always tried to make sure that we mapped all those needs to a principle and ultimately back to a theme. So that theme was additional attributes in there. And then the last one we've shown on this snapshot, because like I say, this is only a snapshot of the mapping process that we used. I need to automate the process so that I can get to the data quicker. So the principle behind that is metadata is represented using a formal knowledge representation language. So that is all mapping into our API and our spatial strategy that we are going to embark on next year. So the next slide then shows how we have created you won't be able to see much of the detail on here. This is just to show that we have very ambitious plans to make a real start of this from next April, because we go in financial years starting in April. So in April, we will be doing all the planning and looking at the strategic approach to that FAIR implementation. But we'll be taking those themes and tackling them throughout that year. I don't think for one second that we'll be able to do it all in the space of a year. I think it will take us longer than that, personally, because the API strategy will probably take slightly longer. We'll have some infrastructure changes to make, etc., etc. But nonetheless, we will be focusing, we will be going back to that mapping exercise, prioritizing, and we already have this high-level roadmap in place, ready to go next April. But there's still a lot of work to go behind that in terms of prioritizing some of the work. We've already started on making some of that infrastructure ready to take these huge changes. And we've also done an exercise, a very, very lengthy forensic exercise in what do we believe the value to the economy would be if we make all these changes. And we estimate that it will make the data sets, currently the top 4 data sets, most likely bringing in the region of £350 million worth of economic drive within the economy. If we did this work, it would uplift that by in the region of £60 million. So it's worth investing in. Our board have bought into this. This will happen next year. So the very last slide that we've got here are the 4 take-home messages. So the things that we really want you to remember from this presentation. So number 1, we've done a significant piece of user research, and we now have a really good understanding of what our users and customers want from us improving the data sets. Secondly, user needs fall into 3 distinct categories: transactional access, additional attributes, and more frequent updates. Thirdly, we have benchmarked our data products for their fairness, as George has explained. Interoperability and reusability have been highlighted as needing specific improvement. And fourth, lastly, but not least, we have ambitious plans for implementing continuous improvement in data products starting next April. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lynn and George. It's been really insightful and really interesting in terms of discussion. I can't believe 32 million polygons. I noted that took 7.79 gigabytes of data and access of 2 million people per day. That's amazing, and also an amazing achievement. I saw some 100% for your findability and accessibility in there. We're going to open the floor for some questions. We've got a couple already. So the first question, if you don't mind me going to Evangelina Balla, if we could get her on the floor. She had a question to ask specifically to you, Lynn. Evangelina, are you still with us? Okay. So she wanted to know how much percentage of property rights or area are not registered in Her Majesty's UK Land Registry.
We calculate that around 12% of land mass isn't registered yet. So, and that consists mainly of, say, large rural areas, or council-owned, local authority-owned property, or land owned by the landed gentry. So there's an awful lot of land in England and Wales that is owned by lords of the manor, etc., and they have, you know, they've probably owned the land in the family for centuries, and so there is no trigger for compulsory registration. So there's roughly 12% of land mass not registered.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers that question for you, Evangelina. I think I might be able to, no, I can't do the unmuting. So our next question came from a gentleman called Ant Beck. I wonder if we can pass the floor to him. No, just one moment. I'll just open the chat again. So this question was to Graham, and Ant wanted to know, what land ontology are you using to support your SPA-QL endpoint?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for your question, Ant. So actually, when we did the FAIR assessment, our linked data sets, when we do that deep dive assessment, actually score quite poorly in their linking with external data sets, because we don't use a specific ontology or shareable ontology for the description, as you just identified. The way that the linked data has been built is using in-house ontologies that actually don't link out. So one of the critical pieces of work to improve that data set is to use something like LADM, for example, and integrate that with the data set so it is fully interoperable and fully linkable with external data sets.
Thank you very much. I hope that answered your question, Ant. We had another question from Mohammed. He wonders if how we do the mapping title plan, because as far as they know, the UK does not have a traditional cadaster.
We don't have a traditional cadastre, no, that is for sure. But I'm not quite, I don't know as I fully understand the question, so I will try and answer that. So the index map that you saw is a map of the indicative extent of all the property, of all the titles to land within England. It's a very complicated subject because it's down to land law. So we actually register titles to land rather than the land itself. And once again, that's another hour's lecture as a completely separate piece of work. So that's why we have a freehold estate in land, or we have a leasehold estate in land. So, and that is, but the closest map that we have to a cadastral layer is that index map that I showed you in one of the slides. So under the Inspire regulations, when we under those regulations where we had to publish the closest thing we had to a cadastral layer was our Inspire polygons, which show only the freehold estates. So it was considered that freehold estates only represent the closest thing to a cadastral layer, not the leasehold estates, if that makes sense. So the closest thing we have is the Inspire polygon. So if you go onto the Use London Property portal that George showed you, you can download the Inspire polygons for free, and they are the closest we have. But they are a subset of that index map that I showed you earlier.
Thank you, Lynn. I think we've got a couple more questions. I've just been informed that you can request the floor if you'd like to ask your questions. So if you could do that through the system, that would be great. Sorry, I'm just going back. We've got another question from Alistair Lewis. Does Hmlr have plans to add additional information to the register of title itself? For example, adding the lessor's title number on the leasehold title?
I think the simple answer to that is no. We don't at the moment. Funnily enough, it's something we used to do years ago, and then made decades ago, and then made an operational decision not to. And the feedback that we are getting, and this comes back, Alistair, to my point that I was saying earlier, that decades ago we couldn't envisage what the usage of our data, how they would change over the last 20 years. And so now that operational decision that we made 20 odd years ago is now causing problems for the data sets that and how users are using those data sets today, because they can't find that linkage between freehold and leasehold. So in answer to your question, no, there are no immediate plans to change that operational procedure, but never say never. So I don't know. If I was going to put money on it, I would say that that's probably a practice that might get resurrected as we start, like for the reasons that I've given.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to take one last question, and this is from Vladimir. And then can I suggest, Dan, it sounds like you've got some deeper dive questions that maybe you communicate directly to Lynn and Graham over those. So Vladimir wanted to know, are Hmlr data sets used in identifying taxable units for tax valuation purposes? That's
a good question. So we do have, on as well as the data sets, we do have data sharing arrangements and agreements across government. So, and we do share data with different government departments. I couldn't say for sure whether they use them for those purposes, but I would have thought they do. It would make sense for them to. All I can say is that we share them, but we don't track what they do with that data. They have to come to us to give a good reason why they want the data, and that they fill out a case to say that it's within the public interest. But that's as far as we know.
Thank you once again, Lynn. So again, Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you very much, Lynn, for your efforts and for all that interesting information. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Claudia, and she is going to take us through the topic of accelerated digitisation and land administration in United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. So before I hand the floor over to Claudia, Claudia Stöcker holds a PhD in land administration from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. She is currently a fellow of the Exist Business Startup Programme at the University of Munster. Her research expertise includes innovation diffusion into land administration, photogrammetry and remote sensing, as well as community mapping. So I'd like to now hand the floor over to you, Claudia. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kathryn. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, please go on.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good. So thank you very much for inviting us today. So I'm here with Dr. Kwabena Asiama, who will join the panel discussion later on, and Dr. Rohan Bennett, who is unfortunately not available today. So with Dr. Bennett in the lead, we are representing FIG here, and we are co-authoring a joint FAO-FIG WPLA publication about the accelerated digitalization and the future role of land administration in the UNECE region and beyond. And in the next 15 minutes, I'll give you a snapshot of this work and its current status and some preliminary findings. So, let me see, is this, yeah. So to get started, I'll first introduce the work we've been doing so far. So what is this publication actually about and why is it needed? And the text we've been drafting feeds into this joint FAO-FIG WPLA publication. And, you know, during the past years and possibly also in the years to come, all of us witnessed the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic with restrictive lockdowns, novel at-distance ways of operating, and entirely different forms of stakeholder interaction. And I think this kind of webinar series is one of the proofs this new forms of interaction. So overall, we had a situation that also challenged existing land administration systems in various qualities. We've seen immediate and creative responses, rapid increases in the demand for electronic services by citizens, and scaling up of e-service provisions. So there are definitely many stories of success, and many lessons worth to be documented and disseminated. And so essentially this joint publication condenses these stories of accelerated digitalization and digital disruption. And it aims to provide a high-level guidance and includes many case examples with Asiama Land Registry is also one of those, particularly focusing on the UNECE region, but also beyond, with examples from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So overall, this publication is intended primarily for decision makers, leaders, and practitioners. Looking at the timeline, we are now transitioning from the drafting phase to a review and consultation phase. And it is intended to publish the document in quartile 3 or 4 this year. Looking at the structure, we have a first short introduction, laying out the basics of the publication and elaborating on what it is intended for. And following this, chapter 2 explores the digital disruption and the need for its embrace in the land administration sector. It looks closely at specific disruption and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then chapter 3 follows this and looking at the contemporary response to this disruption, that is the digital acceleration. And this is followed by chapter 4, which looks more towards the futures and the developments that are ahead, using digital transformation to frame this analysis. Emerging policy priorities and megatrends, as well as technological drivers outlined, likely to shape future land administration systems. And then chapter 5 uncovers different pathways towards the implementation of those developments, including action and investment plans and considering ways to measure benefits and impact. Chapter 6 goes beyond this UNECE region and looks at how these lessons can be transferred to other regions, including Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then chapter 7 provides a conclusion of the key findings and provides immediate actions for individuals and organizations to move forward to the digital transformation of the land administration sector. So now I've used a lot of words, including the term digital, and I think it's quite, it needs a kind of a definition of different terms. And to ensure we are all on the same page, I would like to briefly distinguish three main phases of digital development, being digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation. So we start on the very left with the digitization, involving the conversion of paper records into digital forms via scanning or data entry processes. However, organizational structures and processes are not necessarily redesigned to benefit of the digital data. So this might include, digitizing cadastral maps, registry data, or administrative data. The next step, the digitalization in the center of this figure, leverage digital data to redesign and improve processes and functions and also infrastructure. So this might mean automating decision-making processes or reducing tasks within a process with a particular benefit in mind. And on the very right side, we have the digital transformation, which originates from the digitalization and involving a holistic, strategic, as well as operational redesign of the entire organization. So the digital transformation encompasses all aspects of the land administration organization and may lead to entirely new data-driven service models and product creation. And most importantly, these three phases should be seen in a kind of continuum of digital development. So what are, looking at all these different stories, but also on global principles and guidelines, such as the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, so the IGIF from the UNGGIM, as well as the FELA, the Framework for Effective Land Administration, we distilled 6 essential elements necessary for future land administration systems. So these are intelligence, integration, inclusivity, interactivity, incorporation, and investment. With intelligence, we see that future land administration systems are fully digitalized with a large degree of automation, allowing real-time registration of transactions, combined data-driven and people-driven decision-making, as well as responsive yet effective and efficient services and processes. With integration, we see that future land administration systems are unified throughout the country, allowing for the interoperability of data. With inclusivity, we refer to future land administration systems that are inclusive, and ensuring women, minorities, and vulnerable groups have access to land administration services, and that the system is equitable and promotes peace, safety, and security among all parts of the society. With interactivity, it's really about electronic communication for both the registration, but also the transaction and dissemination of the registered information, which provides an enjoyable basis for public experiences. So I saw it as it should not be a burden to report a land transaction or to register land. And you should not feel like having to go to the dentist, but rather like going to a concert. And when we talk about incorporation, we see that future land administration systems encourage cooperation, partnerships, and multidisciplinary as well as multi-sectoral participation. With land administration being a cross-sectoral discipline, ecosystems can be built, fostering greater coherence and commitment between stakeholders and decision makers. And last but not least, investment, probably the most important one. Future land administration systems should be based on sustainable business models that balance the costs of implementation and maintenance with the affordable provision of land administration services. So looking at these 6 I's, so the key essential elements, we further outlined the key lessons from the different inputs that flow into this publication. And we can say that first, land administration and NSDIs are not islands. They do not function in isolation, and they must be alert to the broader context of government digital transformation strategies and societal drivers. And second, digital disruption is the new normal. So land administration systems must operate in this era of constant disruption, and specifically digital disruption, spurred on by a dynamic internal and external drivers. And third, dynamic capabilities are essential for digital acceleration. So this means the land sector is accelerating towards a fully digitally transformed operating environments. Fourth, future drivers and design scenarios are broad and varied. Well, future land administration systems must respond to post-pandemic policy priorities, including societal megatrends and contemporary technical as well as non-technical drivers. Fifth, action and investment plans enable implementation. The implementation of digital transformation and land administration is not a simple technical endeavor. It is a holistic approach and needs multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral stakeholder engagement. And sixth, local lessons transcend globally. Well, we can see that there are general lessons learned on accelerated digitalization and digital transformation, which can be drawn and that can also be transferred to other regions. However, it's important to note that every country is unique, and before lessons can be adapted, it requires a holistic analysis, including political, legal, socio-economic aspects, as well as technological aspects. And relating this now back to the topic of this webinar, the FAIR principles, we identified those as a cross-cutting theme across the entire publication. So we saw that findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse play a central role in accelerating digitalization and the digital transformation. And they can be found back in the six key elements. So the 6 I's, and as well as in the more globally acknowledged policies as the IGIF strategic pathways, which is currently used or implemented in at least 37 countries. Here, several puzzle pieces work together to ensure that the elements can be met. So with findability, it's mainly about standards, it's about data, innovation, but also about financial aspects and partnerships, making sure that there are tech providers enabling the findability of such data. When we look at accessibility, it's first and foremost about data, but also about communication and engagement, capacity and education, raising awareness among the civil society that there is data out there that can be accessed and used. Looking at interoperability, it's mainly about standards, making sure that this data can be unified in a system. But it's also about governance and institutions and policy and legal, as they are laying down the foundation to create this unified, integrated system. And last but not least, reuse is mainly about innovation and financial. As new revenue streams are being explored, partnerships are established, exploiting and capitalizing on the data which is being provided. And as I mentioned earlier, the publication really looks into many, many different cases and brings them up. And on my last slide, I would just share two of those examples. One is from Poland and the other one from Serbia. So Poland moves towards an open data model since almost 10 years, aiming at the value-added product creation by the private sector, generating employment, more users, and more tax revenue for the government. And in Serbia, a similar trend was experienced with a basic framework, creating a basic framework for unified body for the collection and the provision of all geospatial data, resulting in the development of the geoportal GeoSerbia. And this was established prior to the pandemic, but it only witnessed a surge in use after the pandemic hits the country, showing that disruption can stimulate digital acceleration also on the client side. And with this, I'd like to finish my presentation and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia. That was really interesting, fascinating work. And I'm sure those on the call are going to join me to say very excited about the publication of that document for the FIG. So yeah, looking forward to it. So I think we have a question from Ant again. So could we hand the floor to Ant? Ant, can you unmute yourself or?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to find out what you think might be the key disruptors and enablers in this digital future that you've just presented.
So the key disruptors are certainly the disruption is an event that causes a change in how a system usually works, and the disruption was certainly the COVID-19 pandemic, aligned or coming on top of technological disruption by new technologies available, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, mobile applications, and this huge bunch of technology available to implement. And with the key enablers, I think it's looking at the different cases that we covered in the publication. It's mainly about, and that's fitting to the theme of this webinar, it's the integration of data in a unique platform, and making use of the different geospatial data sets that are collected from various authorities, and with the cadastral data and the registry data making a a baseline for this geospatial platform. And in that, I think it's really the web environment and the new forms of accessing and interacting with stakeholders that might be one of the key enablers for this, having new ways of data dissemination and communication. So maybe my colleague Kwabena, you see this, you can add on that. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Yes, thank you very much. Well, some of the key disruptors you can find from within land administration itself, because land administration as a whole has always been seen as something that is supposed to represent stability. But then within these times, even before COVID, we find that there have been demographic changes in the people who work in land administration itself, and then going on to the technological aspects of how land administration agencies work themselves. So within land administration itself, you have these internal disruptors with the changes in their business model and the like. And these within COVID times have really revolutionized and changed how land administration works. But then on the outside also, you find factors such as the GDP growth of countries that are influencing the way land administration works. You find social, and also within the external disruptors, also demographic changes and changes in people's culture. So with the, for example, with the changes in attitudes, you find that in how people, even before COVID, were looking forward to online services. And you find that in certain land administration agencies, even before COVID, they had, for example, with the Dutch cadastre, they had 99% of their services online, even before COVID. So you had all these external influence changes that were coming in, and then the COVID pandemic actually skyrocketed these things. So in the future, we can imagine that these disruptors would actually change our view of land administration from a stable service. I know there's a little bit weird to say about land administration, because you always want to be sure of who owns what, but it will change the way we look. It might change the way we look at it as something of stability to an ever evolving service. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that explanation. I can't see any more questions in the chat at the moment. Does anybody else have any more questions? From my perspective, I think it's really interesting. The pandemic has really brought digitization, like everything online, but it also comes with vulnerabilities, especially in the political kind of arena with things maybe happening around the world. And I just wonder, especially when you start adding into the dimension of time, that could really bring some other challenges that are outside of the remit of the typical land registry. But yeah, lots of challenges for the future. In our chat, we've got lots of people really looking forward to your publication. So yeah, if nobody else has got any more questions, we're going to move on to the discussion panel. So last opportunity. Does anybody want to ask a further question? No? Okay. So if we can move on to our final section of this programme, and that's going to be some questions and answers for our panel. So on our panel today, we've got Martin Salzmann, from the Netherlands Cadastre Land Registry and Mappings Agency. We're going to bring back Lynn and George, who we met earlier from the UK Land Registry. And finally, we've got our lovely friend who's just joined us, Kwabena Asiama, and I'm so sorry if I've got that wrong, who is a researcher at the Geodetic Institute of Leibniz University. I'll get my teeth in at some point today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce properly our panelists before handing them to the floor, and then we'll pose some questions to them. If you want to ask somebody a specific question, please request the floor or drop your question into the chat, and we will try and get those questions answered. So I'm going to give each of the panelists approximately 15 minutes. We're running a little bit over time, but I think we had some flexibility in the schedule anyway, so I'm just going to go with this. So we're going to continue with the 15 minutes. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, and that's going to be Martin Salzmann from the Netherlands Cadastre Land Registry and Mapping Agency. So Martin is a strategy lead at the Netherlands Cadastre and is actively involved in shaping the Netherlands spatial data infrastructure, digitalization of the public sector, and strategic planning for Cadastre. He has held numerous advisory and management positions within Cadastre and is previous president of the Euro Spatial Data Research and currently a board member of Eurogeographics. So thank you very much, Martin. If we can bring you to the forefront. I'm going to start with the question: why is a comprehensive digital profile for each property important?
Thank you very much, Kathryn, for giving me the floor. And before answering your question, I first want to thank the speakers, which I think gave a very comprehensive and good overview of interoperability of data and accessibility of data is about. So that's, for me, that's a good foundation. I think it's if you look at properties itself, I mean, basically, I mean, the underlying trend you see is that the society digitizes in any case. So, I mean, it's probably the expectation of the public at large, and but also of businesses and the public sector, is that data is available digitally. But what we also see is that more and more people take decisions or orient themselves in digital environments. And if I look at the property market, I mean, it's a market where we have to deal with valuable assets. And what you see, if you want to operate properly in a digital market, or make your decisions or do your planning in a digital environment, or even do a transaction, it's very important that you have all the information available to orient yourself, to build your decisions on, and also to take in the end to really perform the transaction. And I think that's why it's so important to have all the information on the property itself. And I think what COVID showed is that we couldn't even go out and have a look at the property physically. And what you now see is that people, and it gives a much broader scope, are able to orient themselves widely and also come up with wise decisions, or even, on the other hand, posing very clever questions to the ones they are dealing with. So I think that in general, the more information you can have on a property, I mean, I wouldn't say it makes life easier because you have so much information that you can drown in it, but on the other hand, it works towards a level playing field where all parties in the process could have the same type of information and are acting on an equal footing. So that's to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, you know, it's very easy to drown in information, isn't it? It's a balancing act with giving people enough information without letting them kind of get lost in it. So in your opinion, if all property data could be accessed, exchanged and used electronically, what impact do you see that as having?
Yeah, basically, when I looked at the questions which you sent me beforehand, so I mean, basically, I think you should turn the question around, because basically, if you look at the land market or information on land in general, basically, the discussion or the debate would be what impact do I want? And then you have to reverse the question to say, okay, if that's what society needs, and that can differ between jurisdictions, and it can also differ, I mean, in a general sense of how people look at it. I think basically what we want is what I say, okay, we want to have a level playing field, and you have dealings on a transactional level in the land market. And then what you see now is sometimes the professionals have an advantage over the buyers and the sellers, and you say, I want that impact eliminated, so I want to really have a level playing field at the transactional field. If you look at society as large, and if I look at the Netherlands, I mean, we have a lot of things to handle. It's not only the property market, we have a shortage of housing to start with, and I think probably we're not the only country in the world. But we also have a climate change we have to adapt to. We're now in the middle, because of the war, of a type of energy crisis. So we also have to find place for that. So basically, there's a big need in society to have an insight on a more maybe local, regional, or even national level to everything we have. And then I reversed. So I think that's the impact we want or we need in the Netherlands, and it's up to each country or jurisdiction to decide what they need. And then I would say, I mean, in general, make it as open as possible, but at the same time, at the transactional level, also look at the other movements in society where you also have the situation appearing where you have to really to consider, because everything is digital and you don't, I mean, you still are your own individual, or you have your own business. So you have to look at your personal space, which you want to protect, and your personal space is your personal data to start with. But it's also, if I now look at housing information, and you would simply incorporate a BIM model, for instance, in the cadastral registration, I mean, you can't see basically you can identify how people live and how many beds they have in their sleeping room, for instance. So I think, if you look at the transactional level, I think we have to reconsider how we work. You still need the level playing field, but also you have to protect the interests of the parties involved. And I think you have to come to a situation where you have a kind of, basically agreements on how you share data and how you do that, so that everyone can do his thing. And I think at the more local, regional, and national level, I would make it as open as much, because what we see is that we have to solve a lot of these problems I addressed, from climate change to the shortage of housing, as a society, and you can't solve that as an individual. So there I would say, okay, basically try to use or to maximize, and I think our Hmlr colleagues indicated that very nicely, to maximize the openness of data wherever possible. So I switch your question around. So.
Nicely done. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time today, Martin. I've been informed that maybe we do need to finish as close to 10:30 as possible.
Yep.
I've really appreciated your input. So I'm going to juggle things around a little bit, and I'm going to bring Kwabena Asiama to the floor, as we've already heard from Lynn and from George. So just let me get to my piece of paper. So we've got Dr. Kwabena Asiama, and he's currently a researcher at the Geodetic Institute of Lubunz University in Hanover, Germany. His main areas of interest are the real estate valuation, land use planning, land tenure and governance, and customary land administration. He's the vice chair of the International Federation of Surveyors Young Surveyors Network and incoming chair of Commission 8. He received his MSc and PhD at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and he's been working with Claudia and Rowan on drafting the joint Food and Agricultural Organisation, International Federation of Surveyors and Working Party on Land Administration publication on the role of accelerated digitisation and future role of land administration. So if I can pass the floor over to you, I'm going to ask you the question, how important is it to develop common protocols and standards?
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just talk about this in the context of the commonalities and the differences we saw with the various countries when we're coming up with our publication. And one thing that Dr. Stöcker talked about was the continuum of digitalization, and then digital transformation. And within this continuum, you find that a lot of countries are doing so many different things and then labeling it with these different terms. And so it was quite important for us to be able to understand what we mean by digitization. So within that, it was found that you find that three functions. When they digitize, you find three functions over there, looking at the land markets, the emergency responses, and then you also have other spatial data needs. And so this is where you then find the interface between land administration and then other organizations. So, for example, when at the onset of the pandemic, a lot of land sector agencies or land administration agencies focus more on keeping the land market going, because this was we found that in the past the land market can actually crash an economy with the subprime mortgage crisis, as we saw in the late 2000s. And so the land administration's responses to the COVID pandemic were then became actually an emergency response. Now, following that, it was also seen that the spatial needs of countries could actually be supported by land administration. So not just within the land administration domain, but looking at people's housing addresses where there are hotspots for within the pandemic, with people who are getting the COVID-19, then also looking at other ways of distribution of essential services within the economy. And so within this area, you find that land administration was actually had to be in work closely with other organizations. Now, the question then is, now that the world is coming out of the pandemic gradually, now that I think about 3 to 6 months ago, Dr. Fauci declared that the pandemic phase is over and people are getting back to work, can this be continued? In most of these organizations, their responses were in two broad ways. Some changed the legislative framework that they were working with, and so that means that it then becomes easy for them to easily interface with other agencies. But then others also didn't, and so you find that most likely it might just go back to business as usual, and so trying to share information with other agencies, that's where part of the emergency responses may actually be difficult, because of the legislative framework and the processes that weren't actually changed, the underlying process that weren't actually changed yet.
Thank you very much. Okay, in the kind of constructions of getting this moving forward, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time, KB, and I'm going to go back to Lynn and George. So earlier we had an interesting question from Ant, and he asked, you've talked us through a massive transformation program. What are your recommendations for other organisations who are considering a similar journey? The floor's over to you.
Oh, big question. I would say, yeah, we have got a big transformation journey. We've got some really ambitious projects underway, and we've got some equally ambitious projects planned for next year. So they have taken quite a lot of work to get underway. So we had to do an awful lot of research first before we embarked on those projects. So some of those projects are probably 5 to 7 years in total, because they're looking at restructuring. So that register data that I showed you in the presentation, one of the projects is probably 3, 4, 5 years long, and that is restructuring that textual data so that we can do machine learning, and that will have enormous benefits. So, but to actually get that project off the ground, and that's just one of the projects off the ground, we had to really put some passion behind it, and one of the key things was that the board had to buy into it, because the actual project itself doesn't see direct benefits, it enables benefits. And what you tend to find is that enabling projects can, in a lot of organizations, get swept to one side because people can't see immediate benefits from them. So with this, the benefits themselves, we changed things like benefits impact to change impact. So we put a change impact plan together to say, this enabling project will enable all these things. The benefits aren't direct, but not doing anything, doing nothing is not an option. So when you write an options paper, there's always a do nothing section. Doing nothing isn't an option, because if we're going to move forwards, and it was supported by Land Registry's business strategy as well. So our business strategy, which will be launched hopefully in the next month or so, it was supported by that and that team as well, in terms of what is our strategic aim. So all the projects that have got underway have had to have full support, from our board, they've had to buy into it, and we've had to sell it well to them. And our strategic, we've got an expanding strategy team that have also bought into it. So I think one of the key things is getting complete buy-in from different divisions within the organisation, and having all that buy-in come together. I'm exceedingly proud of the roadmap that we've got in place at the moment. We have probably the most ambitious roadmap and the most ambitious transformation plans that I've ever seen in the organisation, and that is in terms of digitising the data and working through so that we can speed up the process of applications through the organisation. So for me, the key things have been buy-in from all different departments within the organisation.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate that. I wonder if we can just invite Martin back to the floor to see what your thoughts are on that topic. What do you see in terms of recommendations for other organisations going through what the Land Registry have gone through? Martin.
Yeah, the situation is you don't really have a one-to-one cookbook which fits every organization, because they start from a different level of maturity. Sometimes if I look at agencies as ours, we are very mature, but sometimes we have a legacy problem, and we are overtaken by other countries who start from basically even from scratch. So I think what we should do, and I think Claudia indicated that quite nicely, but it's also in the IGIF or in the framework for effective land administration. If you look at that, what I think is very important, you have to be balanced. And then I come to the other point that was already made. Sometimes you're in the phase of digitizing, sometimes you're in the phase of digitalization, and sometimes you're in the phase of digital transformation. So pick your point there. And I think a lesson which Hmlr very clearly indicated, look at the community or the jurisdiction you are in, look at the needs that are there, and then choose your strategy, and not the other way around. So that would be my general overall lesson. But always be proud and be operational in the jurisdiction you work, and don't try to be the best of the world. Try to be the best for your society. That would be my first lesson.
That's some great advice. Thank you, Martin. And KB, I'm going to pick on you last but not least. So, you know, from your perspective, what do you think organisations could do who are considering that kind of journey?
Well, I think the three main issues that came up in our work was privacy, security, and transparency. And in this situation, it was in the context of how citizens view land administration agencies and the expanding role that land administration agencies are playing with respect to the contribution of information and how they can access information. But then I will also reiterate on the point that Martin makes, because we found that in the in trying to globalize our work also, Asian countries, Latin American countries, African countries had completely different problems and completely different solutions to it. And so that means that there is no one size fits all solution. And so even within, I can speak very much for the African continent and in Europe. Dr. Stöcker may also step in to mention some bits about Latin America and Asia. But then we found that, for example, in African countries, the collection of spatial information was the problem. But then this was not so much of a problem for European countries. And so, yes, of course, these issues of privacy, security, and transparency were a lot cross-cutting. But then, how each continent, how we saw it in each region, was actually different. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to Ant as well for asking that question. It's really provoked some thoughts around the topic. I'm conscious that we're almost at 10:30 and our time's off. There's a really interesting comment from Dennis in the chat. He states about Ukraine demonstrating the digitization of records and services as well as cybersecurity, and it can be an issue for national security. And I think we can all have that at the fronts of our minds, can't we? I want to just say thank you once again to all of our panelists. It's been really interesting, really insightful, and I'm sure really useful to everybody on the call. So I'm not going to open up for any other questions because we don't have time, but I did just want to say a really, really big thank you and a really interesting meeting. I understand that this is the final meeting of the series, so there's no future dates or anything like that. But I wanted to say a big thank you to Lynn, George, Claudia, Martin, and KB, who've shared so many of their thoughts and ideas. And on behalf of the Geospatial Commission, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to be part of it. It's been a real pleasure to host this meeting. But finally, I just wanted to thank Vicky Abbott, who has worked really hard behind the scenes to pull off this meeting. So thank you, Vicky. And I hope that you've all enjoyed this meeting and found it as insightful as I have. So thank you for joining, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.